and thank you for joining us for this panel on online identity formation. My name is Helena Larrauri, and I'm the director and co-founder of Build Up, a non-profit that focuses on transforming conflict in the digital age. On this panel with me are Maude Morrison, the deputy director of Build Up, Quratulain Fatima from Women for Peace Tech, Hein, Paing to Chit from CEST from Myanmar, and Magrunn Indreboe Alshaikh from UNDP Botswana. If you have been following along with our virtual consultation on online identity formation, then you will know that over the past 2 weeks, we have run a Facebook group that has been trying to look at the mechanics by which online identity is formed on social media. There is significant research that shows that social media alters our incentives, affects how we construct discourse, and therefore how our identities are shaped, and that social media tends to polarize and accentuate these divisions. There's a lot less research on how that happens, what user behaviors, what platform features influence how identity is formed, things like this. And understanding how online identity formation happens is a key to designing any peace-building intervention to try to mitigate online identity-based conflict. We think this topic is particularly prescient in the current context with COVID-19 and therefore very relevant to the topic of the Stockholm Forum, where social distancing has forced even more conversations to move online, even more expressions of identity are happening online. Could I have the presentation now? What I'm going to be doing over the next few minutes is sharing with you some of the findings, the initial findings that we have seen through this 2-week consultation on a Facebook group. Once I finish sharing some of these findings, my colleague Maude will be taking you through an interactive reflection where you will be able to share your thoughts through an interactive poll on what you're seeing about online identity formation. And once we're through with that, we will ask our panelists to reflect on some of the things that we've heard so far. And we will also take some questions from the audience. So if you are in the Twebcast audience and not on the YouTube audience, you should be able to submit a question. There's a submit your questions function that you can see, and we will receive those questions and pick a few to address. Could I have the next slide, please? So here's a summary of what we asked online on the Facebook group over the past 2 weeks. We asked participants in the group to share with us examples of how divisive identities are expressed on social media, but also how common identities are expressed on social media. And then we asked for any examples that they knew of links between online identity expression and offline action. And finally, we asked people to reflect on what features of social media platforms impact the way that identity is expressed on social media. Now, of course, this research isn't comprehensive. We did have a fairly large Facebook group, but it's still a very tentative set of findings. Our hope is to use these tentative findings to continue a conversation about how online identity formation is happening, including through this panel. Can I have the next slide? So what I'm going to share with you is just some of the trends that we have begun to see. When it comes to expressing divisive identities, we had a very rich set of examples. And one of the things that we saw is that by far the most common way to express divisive identities on social media is to dismiss an opinion or position, most commonly through the use of mockery, but also often in combination with dismissing that position as privilege. There's a few examples here. One of them is from the US, referring to the Karen meme, which is a meme that refers to white women, and I won't go into the details of that. But what I wanted to show here is the diversity of the examples that we were getting. We got another example from Myanmar. This is where a politician wrote something that had a double meaning, and then people were mocking it on social media. And then something that was coming from Syria. And that was, again, a joke referring to the use of masks and dismissing it by saying, be careful who you follow. So there were many, many more examples, but we thought it was interesting that there was this trend that was happening in very different contexts of the use of mockery to dismiss a position and also to pointing to privilege as a way of dismissing a position. Next slide, please. Another way that divisive identities are expressed is through the use of fake news And probably not a surprise to anyone listening to this panel. Fake news is often used to accuse a group of a behavior or to associate them with a negative identity marker. And sometimes these negative accusations or associations are not related to fake news, but very often they're supported by some kind of news or misinformation. Next slide, please. Again, this is perhaps less surprising. Another way that divisive identities were expressed on social media was through the use of hate speech or dangerous speech that included different forms of stereotyping or dehumanizing a group, but also very direct requests to exclude a group and occasionally direct threats of violence to a group. This is probably the type of expression of divisive identities that is most often discussed in both in the media and in research. And although it was pervasive, it wasn't the most common way that we saw divisive identities being expressed. Can I have the next slide, please? And then finally, one of the things that we were seeing that I think is particularly interesting is the way that how conversations unfold on social media is affecting the way that divisive identities are expressed. And particularly that we often observed an escalation in a comment thread that led to extreme positions being taken. So perhaps something that started off more nuanced as the comment thread went on became more and more extreme. The example here that is on the right, which comes from Myanmar, is actually the escalation of a conversation to the point of asking or making a sort of a call to violence against Muslims. Another common way that divisive identities are affected by the way that conversations unfold is that social media very often is a place where arguments or narratives become simplified. And this simplification of a position is directly used to shut down dialogue. So I think the example on the left is a good example of that. It's very clearly saying there's no conversation to be had here. Can I have the next slide, please? And I forgot, there was one more. I thought that was the last one that was the last one on divisive identities. And so moving on now to talking about common identities and how those are expressed. So there is actually quite a number of examples of people trying to find common ground on social media too. And that's often done by either expressing common identity markers or identifying common experiences or sharing acts of solidarity with another group. These three often conflated together. There's also straight up positive messaging about identity. So the example on the bottom is an example of that. Ahmadis are a group in Pakistan that is often discriminated against. In fact, we got a number of examples that Quratulain, who will be speaking later, shared with us that were about hate speech towards Ahmadis. But then there's also expressions of straight up positive messaging about this group. Can I have the next slide, please? And then another way, again, that is more about the structure of conversations on social media that is used to express common identities is to try to find some kind of commonality by complicating the narrative on a topic, by nuancing a position, or by pointing out that what might seem a minority experience actually affects more people. So both of the examples here are good indications of that. So I think the one on the left I thought was quite interesting in the way it's constructed. So it very clearly says I have mixed feelings about this, or I'm not saying this, I'm saying this. This kind of use of language is quite common as a way of expressing common identities on social media. Next slide, please. So to summarize, these are the trends that we're seeing. On the side of divisive identities, the dismissal of positions through mockery or by associating it with privilege, the association of a group with negative behaviors or identity markers, including through fake news, the use of hate speech and direct threats, and the escalation or simplification of positions leading to a deepening of divisions. If we look, on the other hand, at the way that common identities are being expressed, we have almost the flip of some of these behaviors. So the expression of common identity markers and experiences, the use of positive messaging about a group, and the nuancing of positions and complicating of the narrative as a way of finding commonality. Next slide, please. So we looked at how divisive identities are expressed, how common identities are expressed. And then we thought, okay, it's important to try to reflect on how these online expressions of identity link to offline action or to offline influence. I would say these findings are particularly tentative. I think we have to dig a lot deeper to understand them better. But here are 4 things that we saw in what people shared with us about their experience. The first is that, and this is perhaps what we all know, there are very clearly specific calls to action on the basis of identity markers that are shared on social media. And these are calls to action online and calls to action offline. Many of these are positive, including offers of support or calls to nonviolent activism, calls to protesting. So that's probably the one that you've heard about and you've seen most often on social media. But here are the 3 that we thought were quite interesting. We saw a few examples of legal action being taken or sought as a result of online behavior, and that legal action, which is offline obviously, furthering the division of identities. That was quite an interesting example. Another one is online rhetoric that was described as resulting directly in a more divisive offline behavior. So this is very linked to the last point that I have, which is about online discourse amplifying or intensifying an offline behavior. We were seeing examples of this happening because online behavior was providing cover for more extreme expressions of identity, or most commonly by escalating an offline experience through online sharing. So an example of that would be there's an offline experience of discrimination that gets shared online. That somehow escalates the situation, and it actually worsens the offline division. Or there's an offline experience that gets expressed in a very combative way online, and that shuts down the possibility for dialogue or conversation offline. So just some trends in the online and offline links. Next slide, please. And then the final thing that we asked on this 2-week consultation on Facebook was we asked people to reflect on what features of social media they thought have an impact on the way that online identity is expressed, shared, and formed. And this is obviously not a scientific poll. We're not suggesting that this is the definitive results, but it's an indicative poll of some of the things that people are seeing. I'm not going to go through all of these features. It's quite detailed and it provided us with a lot of food for thought. But I do think it's interesting to see that people understand and are starting to make links in between the way that social media platforms are structured and function, and the way that we then go about expressing our identity on those. So actually, one of the things that Maude is going to do is ask you to reflect on some of these features of social media in the interactive polling that she's going to be doing. And so with that was a summary of the results that we saw on the Facebook group. And I'm going to hand over to Maude, who will be taking you through some questions for you to reflect on some of these issues that we will then discuss live on this panel. Maude, over to you.
Thank you so much. So you've heard a bit about what we found from the online consultation, and as Helena said, we want to hand this over to you. So I'm going to invite you all to go to this link that you see on your screens, and to do this right now, you can do it on your computers or on your phones, www.menti.com, and enter the code that you see there, 672551. And when you get there, you will see a question, and we invite you to start answering that question. This is going to take you through a series of 5 very short questions that we're going to do, and then review the results live and have a little discussion about them. So please go to that link if you haven't already. And once you get there, you'll see the first question, which is, to what extent do you think social media has impacted your identity? So if you're already ahead of me and already answering these questions, please continue. The first question, what we're trying to really get at is trying to make what Helena just shared a little bit more personal. So I think many of us spend a lot of time talking about social media and how much of a challenge it is, but we want you to reflect a little bit on actually how much has this affected you as an individual. So do you think that some of the issues or some of the examples even that Helena just shared have affected the way your own identity has been shaped? We're interested in your thoughts on that. If you're not already there, and if you're just tuning in, go to www.menti.com and enter that code that you see there, 672551, and we are going to go through these very brief 5 questions. And please go at your own pace. The answers are anonymous, so don't worry about the perfectly thought out answer, but we're really just looking for your initial reactions that we can add to the results of the online consultation. The second question that you'll see when you click through that first one is looking at which of these online expressions of divisive identity, so those that Helena just shared, have you actually seen on your own news feeds? So thinking back to your own Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, any other social media platforms that you use, which of these have you actually experienced or observed yourselves? And this is a multiple choice question. So you can select as many of these as you recognize in your own news feeds. And some of our participants on the online consultation really felt they didn't actually see so many of these things because they perfectly curated their social media environments to be more positive. Others really see a lot of this all the time. So we're interested to see what you personally have seen. Once you've done that question, it will take you to a third question. And again, please do go through this at your own pace. The third question is asking which of the expressions of common identity that Helena shared have you seen on your news feeds? So again, this is not asking you what you recognize in the abstract, what you agree with from the general sense of what Helena shared, but really, really asking for your personal experience. So what have you seen? And again, this is multiple choice, so you can select any of the features that you've seen. Again, this is all anonymous, so please do feel free to share openly. Once you've clicked through that question, the fourth one will ask you how much do the following features impact the way we express, share, and form our identity online. So the poll that Helena just shared on the previous slide about some of the different features of social media platforms that actually influence these discussions. We are interested in your view on how significant you think each of these are. And of course, there are many more features than you'll see on your screen. We've selected the 5 that we got the most traction on in the Facebook group and that came up most often. But of course, there are others, and we know that there are many more than we could fit on this question. So we're interested in your thoughts on that. The final question, and then I can see already quite a few results coming in, which is exciting. So I'm going to share those with you very soon. But the final question, if you're not already there, is asking what can we as peace builders do about some of these challenges? And so really, this is something we haven't yet talked about in the online consultation. It's something we'd love to get your thoughts on. Keep your answers short so we can see them in the next phase of this. But yeah, share with us some of your ideas on what as a community we can start to be doing about this. Many of you are probably already doing really interesting things, but there's a lot more I think we can all agree that we can do to better understand this issue and then to address it. So anyone that hasn't yet voted and that happens to be joining in now, you can still go to this link and you can keep voting. But for now, I think if we can go to the results, we'll have a look at what some of you have already put in. So on the first question, to what extent do you think social media has impacted your own identity? This is quite interesting. You're falling very much in the middle. So there's a bit of disagreement around how significant social media has been to your individual identities. I think this is quite a difficult question to reflect on and probably takes a bit more time than we gave it in this particular questionnaire, but I think it's interesting that we definitely agree that there's some impact. and quite an even spread on how deep that impact is. Personally, I would love to see an age breakdown of this question, which is beyond the scope of possibility in this Mentimeter poll. But I think something that's quite interesting to think about how this would look across different age groups. So if we go to look at the results for the second question, which of these online expressions of divisive identity have you seen in your social media feeds? And again, this is quite evenly spread, which is interesting and not particularly surprising, because the ones that we shared with you just now and the ones that were in this poll were ones that were coming up most often also in the Facebook consultation that we were running. I think it's interesting to see the obvious standout there is that there are less people seeing direct threats of violence to a group, which makes sense when you consider the terms of service of these platforms really aiming to reduce as many of those as they can. Some of the other categories, like the mockery or the dismissing of position through mockery or association with privilege, I think that's a lot harder for platforms to police, and so we see it much more often. So that's really quite interesting to look at, and it's exciting that over 50 people have put their thoughts into this. So thank you all for your participation. If you haven't, you can still do it. We'll take your thoughts into account as we write up the report from some of this. So let's go to the next question and have a look at the results for that. This is looking at expressions of common identity. So again, these are obviously things that you're all recognizing and all seeing. I think that sharing acts of solidarity, this really came out a lot in the consultation as well. So we have so many examples, and I think particularly now in the current moment, and particularly with what we're seeing with the pandemic, we see a lot of shared acts of solidarity. Related to that, I think the identification of common experiences, I mean, particularly this idea that we're going through this together, is something that has come out again and again, and we have a lot of examples for. Slightly less on the thoughts of nuancing a position or pointing out what might seem a minority experience actually affects us all. But again, I think these are all things that you're all recognizing. So it's exciting to see. And if we go to the next result, we'll see how much do the following features of social media impact the way we express, share, and form our identity online. This is quite interesting because it actually mirrors quite closely the results that we found on our consultations. So the algorithms is something that came out on top of our poll as well. I think it's also the thing that gets talked about probably most in these kinds of conversations. So the role of social media algorithms in terms of what content they present to users, depending on their behaviors, has been touted as a really important factor in some of these questions. Virality also came out second on our poll as well. So I can see that many of you agree with that as an important factor. I think the reactions is interesting to see how that came out third. I think a lot of our examples also drew on that, and we had a few conversations in the online group about how the ability to tie specific posts to specific people or friends, or to build on connections that social media platforms have, can be quite powerful in furthering particular thoughts around identity and building, mobilizing communities and building solidarity. So it's really interesting to see. And I'm sure also interesting to see that content moderation is quite low down in your priority list in terms of its impact. I think that also reflects some of our findings, but I also think it reflects what we saw previously, that, you know, some of the greatest challenge in this theme or this subject is not the most extreme expressions of calls to violence and so on, but actually some of the more subtle factors that are shaping our identity. So this is really interesting. And let's go to the final result. Have a look at the next slide to see what you recommended about what peace builders can do to mitigate the impacts of online identity formation. And there are probably too many of these for us to see them in great detail, but I'm seeing a lot of things on media literacy, creating digital spaces for common ground, again, promoting analytical thinking and media literacy. This is coming up a lot and comes up, capacity building, education. I think this is really coming out very strong. So focusing on people's analysis capacities, but we're also seeing some comments around creating online spaces for dialogue and actually engaging in conversations online rather than simply taking posts down, posting counter statements, so proactive responses to this kind of work. This is amazing. I'm so happy to see so many of these results, and we are going to be producing a report that summarizes the outcomes of this consultation. So we'll include many more of these than I can in this. Advocating for more safe spaces. I see that coming up quite a lot, actually. So creating places that people don't feel perhaps as threatened as they might in public spaces. That comes up a lot. I saw also some notes on collaboration and the idea of engaging people with governments, social media companies, NGOs, and so on. I think we can keep going a little bit. Let's just keep it scrolling. I think we've come back round to the top. So I think with that, and there's so much we could dig into, but I think with that, I'm going to hand over to our panelists to get their reactions on the consultation that we ran and that they were all a part of on Facebook, but also on some of the findings that we've shared today and also the findings that we're seeing coming in front of us now. So I'm going to start by handing over to Quratulain and ask you to speak for about 5 minutes on your reactions to all of this. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Maude, and thank you, Build Up, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's quite interesting to, first of all, to be part of that consultation and in the times of COVID that every one of us are sitting inside and are more dependent on our social lives online. So there are certain things for me when I see them online, they frustrate me, and certain things that make me happy. So it's the same when I see people sharing common grounds, like we are in Pakistan, a lot of people are sharing their acts of helping out other people during this time. It makes me happy. But on the other hand, I don't know, I think it's due to the logarithms or due to the content I usually look at. I most of the time see positive news. But I've seen that if I go from another profile and I am used to following a certain time of negative news, then it will come in front of me. So as a peace builder, what I'm seeing is sometimes not true. So that is also very important to look at, that the logarithms are so much important and how the content comes across to us is important. It is going to show us the real picture. So mostly it's all about perception over there. Like Helena was saying that in Pakistan, there is a lot of scrutiny and there are not many safe spaces available to minorities or women publicly. So most of them like to express themselves anonymously online. Because I use a lot of Twitter, so I saw one example of Ahmadis, which is a minority sect here, and there was a lot of hatred going against them, and they're not considered Muslims, and there are a lot of fake news that goes around them, something which Helena was also mentioning, that an incident happens offline, and then it is fake news is created about it online, and then escalates this behavior of hatred towards them offline. So this is something that is so sensitive, that people who want to create a common ground against these threats, they can only do that safely online. So I think it's such a great thing for people to express themselves safely online, which is a big feature for countries like Pakistan, which is not really safe for women and minorities. In the same manner, we were talking about hashtags, that how they can create common or divisive grounds. We saw this in the case of Women March in Pakistan, which is a movement and which culminates into having big women marches on 8th March. So it's easier for women who do not have any place in the patriarchal public spaces to go online and create a movement about their rights and talk about how they want to express their opinions. And in that, in a certain way, fake profiles or anonymity really helps as well, because then you are hiding behind something and you cannot be hurt offline, and you can say your things. And that is one thing, like with any hashtag like Aurat March or Women March or anything, that creates common ground in a way, but that also creates divisive grounds. Like we just saw the poll that you conducted. It was very interesting to see that 50% of the people said that their identity is not impacted by their own online conversations. So I think age group and gender also matters in that as well. If you're a woman, you might be more able and happy to express yourself online, and your identity has been impacted by online. That is the same true for teenagers who spend most of their time online. So it really depends upon the context as well. So I think that's all I want to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Quratulain. And if I can hand the floor over to Hein, be interested to see some reactions from you and from Myanmar.
Well, first of all, thank you, Build-Up. Thank you, Maude. Thank you, Helena, for inviting me to this panel. And I think it is really important to understand how identities are formed and shaped online and how it is affecting our lives, especially in this time, where a lot of us are practicing physical distancing and socializing mainly online. In fact, this is the first time in history where we are telling people to be online more and stay away from people physically. So, and I appreciate you doing this analysis, and I admire that. I will reflect a bit based on our situation in Myanmar. So for us in Myanmar, internet is a relatively recent tool, but a very fastly growing phenomenon. So however, in Myanmar, as Helena showed, Facebook is so popular that it is almost equal to the internet itself. For a lot of people, Facebook posts are taken for granted, and there is almost no differentiation between credible source versus a random post written with a hashtag. That's not a strange phenomenon, in fact, because we took a big jump from a propaganda education to 120% of mobile penetration in a few years. So no one has trained for this kind of information, of course. And as we can imagine, a lot of people take the information mostly from Facebook without any distinction between opinions or facts. And you describe what information received, largely shape identity of a person. So this is especially true when a message is spread by a massive number of people, as we can see in our ethnic and religious conflicts and hate speech. It may not be deliberate campaign sometimes, but just virality. It behaves like the same. So the polarization effect of social media, which profile people in different groups and confirm them their cognitive biases. Cognitive biases may be extremely important in addressing massive fake news spread. As we have seen in the polls, media literacy is very important. People may hold different grounds and battle these grounds with virtual reinforcement. So as you have correctly mentioned, there has been a lot of mockery to dismiss different opinions. So currently we are having a great Facebook debate about sex education in Myanmar, with the cultural standards and sex education and things. So many ultranationalists become anti-sex education. It is astonishing to see how people are having cognitive dissonances. That is a phenomenon where their beliefs and new information are not aligned. So it is a good study to do on how people communicate, tag, mention, share with their friends, and confirm their biases. This is exactly what is happening, as you mentioned in the research, like the social media ran ads for businesses. So I think social media has two obvious goals in the context. First is to attract the customers, stay online. And second is to figure out what users like or don't like, To do this, the social media give us two major things in return, like information and social connection that may lead to formation of groups and online communities. But sneaky thing here is like information is not necessarily true. It may be misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and a whole range of deliberate fake news or just opinions. As you pointed out in presentation, people become groups around these informations, by hashtag tags, mentions, shares, comments. So to me, identities are constructed with the building blocks of beliefs, affiliations, personality, experiences, and values. So I think what we really need in the context is like in the digital era is to understand how we think, to realize how our identities are developed, to be able to reflect, to be able to educate ourselves. And I think, last year, May, exactly this month, some ultranationalists gathered around the three sites of Muslim Ramadan prayers in Yangon, so forcing them to stop. In response, Buddhist monks carrying citizens decided to reach out to the affecting communities and handed out white roses to show solidarity with the Muslim neighbors. And the movement was spread from Yangon to the other cities. So the information spread and coordinated through social media with a hashtag called White Rose for Peace. So I think there is hope. So social media is a tool like a knife or a car, if you want. So a user must have good intention and skill. If it is not the case, it may be harmful to them or the others. So as you know, but sometimes in the case of Myanmar, we see direct threat to some groups. So which is maybe a little bit different from the poll, but we definitely have that. So I think in this era, in order to trick the algorithm, which try to babble, put us into groups, the only way we can make use of internet social media is with great education. So that's my reflection from Myanmar. And I want to thank you again for contributing to this research, this analysis to understanding of the online identity formation. Thank you.
Thank you, Hein, and thank you for contributing. I think that was all really interesting. And I'm going to hand it over to Magrunn to hear your thoughts and reactions to all of this.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate. It's been really interesting to be part of the online sort of discussions over the past few weeks. Also because it's made me reflect on my own social media platforms, how we engage with it, and I guess also particularly now during COVID, when all our interactions are online, how people's behaviors change, or how some sort of characteristics or personality traits are somehow accentuated when we're engaging online and via video calls or just sort of voice interactions. I find, and this is based on the work that you as Build Up did in Lebanon, and it resonated with the first comment that you made, Helena, that some of us have curated our sort of social media platforms so perfectly that it becomes quite difficult to pick out those examples of very divisive speech or comments or posts. And I think that the sort of social network analysis that was done in Lebanon really hit that home in terms of how siloed our engagement online is, and how aware we need to be of those silos, because we are essentially talking to each other. And we may think that we are trying to open up the space and we're portraying these sort of messages of common identities, but essentially we are talking to those who already perceive those common identities as common. And I think, and that made me reflect on how we engage online. Why do we go online? Why do we create posts? What is it that we post about? And it made me think of the sort of race for likes, that we want to put something out there that we want other people to like and engage with and interact with. And it's somehow an affirmation of belonging. You want to belong to your network. And so therefore you are chasing those affirmations. And I think with the sort of simplification in terms of the language that we use when we engage online, that very quickly then, without us even intending necessarily, it becomes divisive. And with the use of hashtags, we think we are expressing common identities, but because we are also using mockery, because we are trying to communicate messages that are quite simple and that are quick to absorb and quick to understand and read, we are simplifying things in such a way that we are potentially also polarizing. And we're entrenching those identities that we may not necessarily have originally intended to. And that made me also think about the way in which we use humor and satire and sort of political mockery that we think are quite funny because they express certain visions or opinions in a very sort of astute way, although we understand, of course, that they are much more complicated. And that sort of communication is very much at odds in terms of the complexity of what makes up a person's identity or a group's identity. And we're not able to communicate those complexities at all through the language that we're using. So that made me reflect on sort of how do we work that sort of disconnect between the way in which we engage online and the language that we're using on our social media platform with the complexities and layers of identity formation. And that also resonates now in the times of COVID, when if you are forming your opinion of somebody first online and through the engagements that you have online, I think we have all been part of those group conversations where you sort of want to roll your eyes at the comments that are coming in from certain people. That deters your then offline engagement with that person. Although you should be aware that that person is so much more than what they are expressing in a text or what they're expressing in a simple social media post. So that's also something that is quite interesting to look at. I think also, I mean, one of the questions I also have is, what is our aptitude to really engage online in uncomfortable topics and moving into uncomfortable territory or conflictual territories, if very often we are motivated by engaging with our network and somehow getting some sort of affirmation that we are part of a broader group and a broader sort of set of people. So how willing are we to then engage in those topics that are complicated, and how willing are we to complicate the narrative and complicate the conversations that we are part of? And I think also linked to that, when we engage online, yes, we engage, but do we really listen? And I think as peace builders, that's very important.
I think we're briefly losing connection to Botswana, but I think we already got some. Sorry, Magrunn, I think we just lost you, but I think you are already coming to your natural conclusion.
Yes.
Do you want to make a closing sentence?
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, the last thing I wanted to say is how do we then build trust? How do we build trust online? And how do we raise awareness of the siloed nature of the conversations we have? And how do we encourage people to listen, as opposed to just correct what we perceive as a wrong when we engage? So that's it from me.
Thank you all so much. It was, I'm so happy to hear your reactions, and they were all just really in line with what we've been thinking about, but also helping us think through this even more deeply. So just before we go into Q&A, just to try and kind of pull out some of the threads from all the things that you just shared with us. I think from Quratulain, what I really love about what you said is this idea that this issue and this challenge that we're talking about plays out very differently for different demographic groups. And I think that's an important question for us to dig deeper into. Out of this consultation, we have a lot more questions than answers, but I think that's a really, really important one. I think, Hein, I really appreciated the link that you made between this idea of identity and the spread of misinformation. I know that in Myanmar, this is something that has been talked about a lot, but I actually think it needs to be talked about much further afield than just Myanmar. So this idea that misinformation is a challenge because social media is so entwined with identity, and people believe and share break news on the basis of their identity and this concept of cognitive bias that you shared. And also appreciate your reminding us that this is not all negative and that there are a lot of positive examples that we received in the consultation that we should not forget about. And then Magrunn, I sort of want to repeat everything you said, but I just think if I had to pull out something, it is really important to remember that, and also to reflect at the personal level that we are in silos when we move in these conversations online. And even when we don't necessarily mean to be propagating these kind of silos, we are, because of the nature of this online environment and the simplification of conversation that happens. And so, and I think the longer these conversations go online, the deeper those silos can become. And so, and then finally, just to kind of tie it to the Q&A, I hope is that you highlighted that this has really important implications for programs. So being aware of ourselves and our silos has really important limitations on what we can do, as particularly in the peace building sphere, but also in terms of building trust and entering into new spaces for dialogue that might be a little bit uncomfortable. So I really appreciate everything that you all shared. I'm going to hand back over to Helena. I think we've had some questions that we will take from the audience.
Yeah, so thank you all for those reflections. They were really very deep. And I wanted to pull out one question that came through the webcast. And if there's anyone else who wants to send us questions, you can continue to do so, and we'll still try to address them. So there was a question that came from Dechasa Herpesa, who was asking, what is the consequence if government bans social media? Is it against the right of accessing information? Or what is your reflection on this? Because there are some youth who play a very destructive role using social media. So this issue of, should social media be banned, or often the question is more, should certain types of content be taken down from social media, and to do that very proactively as a way of containing some of the divisive effects of social media. This is a question that a lot of people are grappling with, including the platforms themselves. We've had conversations that build up with different platforms about how content moderation should be happening. So it's definitely something that people are thinking about quite a lot. I think my initial reaction to this is we have to be careful that by taking down content, I'm less worried about the access to information issue, which is also an issue, but I'm more worried about the fact that we're essentially burying a signal that we're getting from social media. We're burying the signal that there is an identity problem or there is hate in a society. And my perspective is, do we really want to take that content down, or do we want to engage with it? Now, of course, there are certain types of content that should be taken down when we're talking about direct calls to violence, for example. But other content, is it about taking it down, or is it about engaging with that space as a space for dialogue? Because if we take it down, that conversation doesn't disappear. People are just going to go somewhere else. So for me, the question is more about engagement than it is about taking down. I'd love to hear, maybe if we can start, Quratulain, with you. What are your thoughts on this question that came from the audience?
Yeah, I find it very interesting while living in a country that is already regulating the use of social media. Like every other day we get this SMS from the government that you're not supposed to talk about blasphemy or hate towards a religious group or this and that. So this becomes a two-edged sword. So we live in a country of minority Sunni Muslims, so everything is geared toward their perception. Like you cannot speak against the Muslims, but you can speak against the Christians or the minorities, and it's kind of okay. So, and there are a lot of other curbs on freedom in a country like Pakistan as well. So when we have to tackle this issue very carefully, are we giving what kind of content we are going to ban is important, but it is more important that who will decide that. It is more important that what are the conversations that need to happen and what are the conversations that need to be curbed. Personally, I am fan of free speech. Everyone should be allowed to talk and have a dialogue. There should be, I think government should more be like a supporter of a dialogue rather than, telling you to not speak or take this content down. I see that eventually when you talk about issues with time, you learn, you get educated to dialogue. So in my opinion, we should let the people decide as long as it is not really culminating into direct threats or direct acts of violence against a certain group or certain people. I am not really a fan of government regulating social media as such. Thank you.
Thanks, Quratulain. That's a really interesting perspective. And I know quite probably others have thoughts about this as well, but just in the interest of time and trying to get a diversity of questions, I'm going to move on to another question and ask one of the other panelists to address it. So we got a question that said that the panel has made a number of references to the demographic divide for this kind of work. And the question is this globally true? Can we reliably access youth audiences through social media? So Hein, I'm going to throw this one over to you because your work has focused actually very much at Seed for Myanmar in connecting with youth on social media. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think it's geographically different. Even in Myanmar, it differs from states to states. So I think, for example, in Molomyai, we don't have that much religious divide and stuff, but in other areas, we have a lot of the religious divides, which is intensified and amplified by the social media. So I think it is really geographically different. And one of the things is that sometimes you can meet people who are, the same in the same opinion, who has the same opinions with you. So this also confirm even more to their biases, and this really creates a lot of link between the online and offline movements, and this actually created interdependence between the social media and the reality in real life. But sometimes it's not balanced. Social media has a lot of, I have a lot of identities, but one is amplified on social media and people interact with this. And I think it is true for a lot of people. And especially in Myanmar, for example, we have different, very different ethnicities, a lot of ethnicities, but in some other areas, ethnicity problem is not big, but religious problem is bigger. So I think also the pattern of use of social media is also different from region to region. So I think it is really resonate with the idea of the identification, the formation of social media is different from region to region.
Thanks, Hein. And I think there's a lot more to discuss around this issue of exactly who we reach through social media, but I think that's an interesting kind of beginning to answer that question. I think we have time for one more question. Magrunn, this is going to come your way. And this question relates to the first question that we shared with Quratulain. And it asks very specifically about freedom of expression. So it says, how do you mitigate the risks of freedom of expression that threatens peace offline through social media? That's a big question, but it's something you started to address in your remarks. So maybe if you'd like to say something else about mitigating that risk.
just repeat it again. How do you mitigate the threats of freedom of expression offline? Online.
Yes. That's how I understood the question as well.
Yes. Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, I think online we allow a lot more. We engage a lot more in statements or with statements that are perhaps stronger than what we would offline. So I think the challenge then becomes, how do you, like you were saying in terms of content moderation, how do you engage with that content responsibly so that it doesn't translate into offline confrontations or reductions in freedoms as such, or attacks on freedoms. And I was thinking, some moderation needs to happen, and some, freedom of expression has its limits. But as you moderate that online, how do you engage with a perpetrator as such, as with a communicator? You shut it down and you curtail it, but do you also attempt to engage, even if it's bilaterally, and engage that person in a conversation as to why that has happened, and why certain things are not tolerated or not allowed. And similarly, as you curtail those freedoms of expression, how do you inform the broader community that you are doing so, and the extent to which you're doing so, and the extent to which there is content that they're not getting to see? Because you also need to be aware of what kind of conversation you are actually engaging in. If you're only seeing a part of that dialogue because everything else has been blocked out and sanitized, then what does that mean? Because it could be that those people who are not aware of what has been blocked could have been much more effective in terms of switching the conversation around, because they would in fact not become comfortable with those expressions in the first place. I don't know if that answers, but I think it's a lot about how we moderate and how we engage with that explosive material. But I think even perhaps more importantly is not so much in terms of freedom of expression, but if we are seeing that it's more and more the sort of subtle divisiveness of our language that is having an impact, because it's constant and it's over time, then how do we engage with that? Because it doesn't reach that limit of freedom of expression. It appears as almost innocent. So how do we as peace builders sort of engage with that sort of subtle divisiveness?
I think it's how do we engage and what incentives do we have to engage? I mean, sure, as peace builders, you can say our incentives are that's what our profession is. But what are the individual incentives for engaging in a more constructive way? And how do we build those in, instead of building in incentives to engage in a way that further polarizes? I think that's also something that needs to be explored in response to this question. But we're running out of time, so I'm going to hand back to Maude, who just has a quick closing statement with a slide with some more information.
Yeah, so if we can go to the slide, we really just want to emphasize that this is a continued conversation. This is really the beginning, and so we hope to continue to talk about these issues together with you all. There are a few ways you can do that. So the Facebook group that we ran this consultation on is still, you can still join it, and we'll post the report that we write from this work there. We also invite you all to join us at our annual conference, which will happen either in Cape Town or online or both in November. And to sign up to our newsletter, we have the link there on the slide. And of course, just contact us on Twitter or email anytime. I just really want to thank everybody at the Stockholm Forum for having us and for giving us this space to have this conversation. To all three of our panelists who just did such a fantastic job of reacting and summarizing some of these challenges. And to anyone who voted in the polling today, that was fantastic. And yeah, really appreciating your involvement and looking forward to continuing to talk about these things with you. So thank you all very much and wishing you an enjoyable rest of your day or evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Welcome to this online debate on stabilization.